Hey everybody, you are in the right place for the Ash Center's special briefing, getting out the BIPOC vote, digital strategies to build power. We're just going to wait a few more moments to let a few folks join. Thanks for your patience. Okay, James and Melissa, I think should we get going?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to everyone for hopping on. You are in fact on the right webinar if you are looking for the Ash Center Get Out the BIPOC Vote, Digital Strategies to Build Power. Today we have a really exciting slate of presenters representing a diverse set of organizations doing really exciting work when it comes to not only voter turnout and engagement, but also building tangible power through a series of strategic practices, strategies, engaging a variety of communities in states like North Carolina, Wisconsin, California, as well as many other parts of the United States. This is going to be a combination of some very brief presentations from our presenters, as well as an opportunity for audience engagement. And first, I just want to acknowledge that the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, which has long served as a site of a meeting and exchange among nations. Again, we will have Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes of this presentation. And so we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. And then finally, we want to make sure that the Harvard community that is on today's presentation knows about the Harvard Votes Challenge, a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a civic culture at Harvard by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to join via the URL voteschallenge.harvard.edu. And I imagine that can be put in the chat as well. And then finally, this event is indeed being recorded. It can be found on the Ash Center website, as well as a YouTube channel after the event has concluded. So just to be mindful that this event is being recorded, but we do hope to have a lively discussion. So in addition to hearing from the presenters, we hope to engage in a conversation about relevant strategies, tools, practices that have worked for engaging voters of color and young people, but also to dive into some of the challenges and tensions that are often present in the digital organizing space. So really appreciate everybody joining. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Great. Okay, so my name is Nick Chedley-Carter. I'm an Ash Center Technology and Democracy Fellow. I'm also the managing director of a program called Resilient Democracy, which is a civic engagement initiative focused on scaling effective and equitable civic engagement practices. Today, we're going to be joined by Arianna Genis, North Carolina State Director for Mijente, Eskadar Gitahun, interim CEO at PushBlack, Vincent Pan, who is the co-executive director at Chinese for Affirmative Action, and Symone Smith, the development manager at Wisconsin Voices. And in just a minute, we'll be turning it over to our panelists. So welcome. And just a little bit about myself. My background has largely been in political organizing and issue advocacy. This has been done both for issue advocacy organizations like Planned Parenthood, as well as political candidates ranging from the local to national level. Have also spent some time at media companies, ranging from producing local public access television in rural New England to working at a global media company in New York, and have been in my current role since 2018. So as I mentioned, I am the managing director of Resilient Democracy, in addition to a fellow at the Ash Center. And a big part of our work does center around how to make voter contact and civic engagement and grassroots organizing as effective as possible for rapidly changing civil society environment. One of the frustrations that we saw in the civic engagement space going into the 2020 election cycle was a disconnect between promising practices, tools, and strategies and organizations rooted in communities. That there's a lot of emphasis on Black and brown groups to turn out and engage certain voters, but all too often these groups were excluded from some of the conversations, some of the funding, and some of the access to data and tools. And some of the programs you're going to be hearing about later today, are some of the examples of how groups are trying to address those gaps. So some of our priorities, scaling effective practices. So digitally savvy relational organizing, for example, blended organizing, which you'll hear about in Wisconsin and from Push Black. Encouraging voter registration. I think one of the concerns that we have going into this election cycle is that voter registration numbers are not where they should be, particularly for voters of color and young people, and that there's a lot of emphasis on the horse race. But in the meantime, really concerned about what we're seeing on the ground when it comes to voter registration as well as vote by mail requests, particularly for underrepresented voters. We're doing a fair amount of work around election administration. Again, we see, for example, taking Pennsylvania, which is really a good example of sort of ground zero as states across the country navigate a very difficult environment, that there are a lot of concerns about how underrepresented and new voters are going to learn about these election changes, but also have the agency to participate. So, there's a lot of emphasis being put on vote by mail right now, and we strongly encourage people to request ballots, but also ensure that there's ballot Dropbox as well as accessible polling locations. And then finally, we're in the home stretch of the 2020 census, and we think it's really important that everything is being done possible to encourage participation in the census, and being mindful of the implications that this is going to have for 2021 redistricting. So some of the activities that you're going to be hearing about that we think this work is very relevant to. So again, voter registration, messaging around the pandemic, and really interesting work happening around the integration of mutual aid and civic engagement, vote by mail, and a broader set of changes that are going to impact voting this election cycle. And then finally, acquisition membership recruitment. And so, really building organizational strength, whether that's data and contact lists, that most of the organizations that we work with and all of the organizations you're going to hear from today, are doing year-round work. That yes, the election is very important, but it's also part of a longer organizing strategy, and how groups are navigating issue advocacy, for example, and how that integrates with their voter engagement programs. So I am going to turn things over to our panelists. Arianna Genis from North Carolina and Mijente. Arianna, are you there?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to do quick intros from our panelists, and then turn it over to a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I'm very excited. So again, my name is Arianna Genis, and I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am the state director here for Mijente. I am Chicana, and my parents are, I come from parents who are working class immigrants and immigrated from Mexico now more than 20 years ago. And I started my organizing work for racial, gender, economic, and climate justice my understanding of that in 2013. And really, I think I stumbled upon my biggest, I think, loves of organizing. So the first one is the role of storytelling. And that is how I found my way into digital organizing in particular. And as a young Latina who was interested in campaign and political work, it was very hard to get into strategy rooms. So I found that a smart way to get into those rooms was by being a digital strategist, because it was a field that was still in development. And so I really want to name that for our folks listening to that there are many ways that you can insert yourself into strategy rooms by bringing in a unique expertise. And then from there, and then my other was my love of using electoral campaigns as organizing opportunities and as opportunities to do leadership development in BIPOC communities. And so I ran my first campaign in 2017 and really saw the power of bringing in new talent into the electoral field, especially from the grassroots and honestly from the artist scene. So our campaign was a mix of all of those kinds of people. And that is what I think gave us the winning itch in the first campaign, was that it was many different kinds of people from experiences and especially people from the community. So it was a local race. And then after that, it just kind of kept evolving in that wavelength of really seeing like, one of the best things we can do is to develop capacity in communities and to show that electoral work is just another expression of community organizing, as is voting, as is all these other things that we engage in our democracy. We have to do the work of civic engagement, and part of how we can do that is through electoral campaigns, and you can win. That isn't the first campaign that I've been a part of that won at the end, and winning can be defined by many different things. So I want to name that. It was candidate campaigns and issue campaigns. And it was that kind of approach to the work that brought me to Mijente. I jumped at the opportunity to be able to run a field program and a state program that was both about engaging voters and mobilizing our people, our gente, which you're going to hear me say a lot, to vote. But it was also an opportunity to develop capacity in North Carolina that has one of the fastest growing Latinx community in the country. And it is underserved and largely unseen. And so at the opportunity to be able to develop that capacity and run a campaign that's looking not just at the end of 2020, but beyond it, it's been an absolute privilege, even with all the obstacles. Mijente is a national organization that is membership based. We have a goal of being a political home, a political casita for Latinx folks all across the country, moving agendas of racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. We're an organization that was really born out of necessity and a sharp realization from our founders that demographics does not mean destiny. So yes, our Latinx people are some like the fastest growing community, and that does not mean that therefore this immense group of folks is going to put forward values of racial, gender, and economic justice. That actually takes organizing capacity, that takes politicization, that takes real campaigns that can actually shift the lives of our people and improve them, right? So a very big community that is going to get scapegoated, which is what we're seeing right now, with not a lot of infrastructure to fight back and not a space to grow as people and combat oppression, was something that we wanted to help address. And so those are the roots of Mijente. And I really just want to also share that one of the big things that that I reflect on as someone who works at Mijente, but as someone who's also Latina, is that this moment demands more from us, not just more of us. And so that is how we approach the work and why we're so dedicated to doing absolutely electoral work. And so we are going to do that, but it is to create the conditions for our people to thrive and win and evolve in this moment and beyond it.
Thank you very much, Arianna. And we'll be hearing from Arianna again shortly. Escadar with Push Black, are you with us?
I am. I'm here. Thank you for having me, Nick and Ash Center. I'm really, thank you, Arianna, for setting a really great grounding for our conversation today. That was all very beautifully put and resonated a lot with me. So just gonna quickly tell you that I'm here representing Push Black as interim CEO. Push Black is the nation's largest media advocacy organization for Black Americans, and we currently serve 9 million people across all of our platforms. This is our leadership team. In addition to us, we have 17 digital campaigners, technologists, organizers, a small but mighty team publishing Black history news and stories across a variety of platforms. So I'm currently serving as interim CEO. Prior to that, I served as chief of staff. I've been with Push Black for a little over a year. And my journey to Push Black, I come from over a decade of supporting organizations in growing strategically and sustainably. So both focusing on people, so strong teams and leadership, as Arianna mentioned, and also process. And so I've done this work in community development organizations, higher education, and more recently transitioned into a role prior to Push Black at Move On, working on a midterm election project for the 2018 midterm. So that was my foray into politics, and really my understanding that the levers of change really focus on our ability to organize, and being at Push Black and really understanding the breadth of access and trust that the organization has built over years with our subscribers is really empowering. It's been really empowering to be a part of this work at such a critical time in history for Black Americans. But as Arianna said, we do spend a lot of time thinking about what that means for our team in terms of our own labor and how to balance sort of managing our own health and doing this really important work. And I know we'll be talking a little bit more about our current context in a bit. So to really focus on what Push Black does, we use the power of narrative, especially Black history, to educate and activate our subscribers to build their own personal power and create lasting economic and political change. And so what's really important to highlight here, and we'll expand upon later, is that Push Black engages with our subscribers year round. Clearly, this is an important get out the vote effort that we are in currently, a nonpartisan effort to really get Black people out to vote. But that trust is built year round, and it's built by sharing information that is relevant and that subscribers have told us that they are interested in. So it's not just about asking them to go out and vote, it's about connecting the dots and being a trusted source of news and information. We do this across a few different platforms. As I mentioned, we have our sort of capstone founding platform of Black History News. We also just launched the Black History Year podcast a few months ago, which was hugely successful. It debuted on Apple Podcasts as #1 in history, and #6 in the overall Apple Podcasts. And we have over 600,000 downloads at this time. And we've recently launched a Push Black finance channel that focuses on economic empowerment and finances, which is, again, something that our subscribers told us that they have interest in learning more about. And so we create compelling stories and campaigns. We share them across multiple channels, and then we educate Black people and inspire them to take action with the ultimate goal of advancing Black liberation. So that is Push Black. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Eskadar. Next, we're going to be going to the state of Wisconsin. For a variety of reasons, folks are surely seeing Wisconsin in terms of relevance to the 2020 election, but also as an epicenter of activism related to social justice and police accountability. Joining us is Symone Smith from Wisconsin Voices. I would also point out that we're really pleased to have Wisconsin Voices here because often conversations around digital are centered in national or coastal context. And, some of the most exciting innovation that we see happening in the civic engagement space is largely driven by folks like Simone, like Arianna in the States, because, they're facing the challenges and realities, living and breathing them. And so I'm really pleased Simone is able to join us. Symone Smith.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to Harvard and the Ash Center for having me today. Hello, everyone. My name is Symone Smith, and I'm the Development Manager for Wisconsin Voices. Wisconsin Voices is located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's a collection of 60 or so nonprofit organizations. Wisconsin Voices acts as a convener, provides technical and data supports, training, and funding to its 60 nonprofit partners. Wisconsin Voices has a specific focus on communities of color, urban and rural communities, and youth. I started at Wisconsin Voices, I want to say over a year ago as the digital coordinator. And so I was in charge of creating and deploying a variety of targeted Facebook ad campaigns intended to be educational and to combat misinformation. I pivoted to fundraising or development early this year in about January or so. Wisconsin Voices made early investments in its digital capacity for 2020 and is working on a coordinated digital organizing program with local and national partners like Push Black. And the goal of the program does a couple things to drive scaled voter turnout, regularly engage hundreds of thousands of voters with digital content and the issue education, grows the digital engagement capacity of critical C3 organizations who are a part of the program, and then build a base of hundreds of thousands of subscribers that will hopefully last past the election. We believe that customized digital relationship building and campaigns led by trusted local organizations in Wisconsin may be one of the most effective voter engagement investments that can be made. That's Wisconsin Voices, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you very much, Simone. Last but surely not least, Vin with Chinese for Affirmative Action.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to the rest of the panelists, and thank you to everyone who's out in the audience. My name is Vincent Pan. I'm with Chinese for Affirmative Action. I'm here in San Francisco, California. If you've seen on the news, we have red skies and dark skies, and so it really is nice to be with all of you today. Chinese for Affirmative Action is a community-based civil rights organization. We've been around since 1969. Some of our early work focused on impact litigation. We won some Supreme Court cases, including Lau versus Nichols, which established the right of English language learners to public education. We've done work to make sure that the public sector is inclusive of people of color and women. We're currently leading a campaign called Yes on Proposition 16 in California, which would reverse the ban on affirmative action in California that's been in place since 1996. A little bit about me. I think I was born into this work. My dad was working in Chinatown restaurants and going to law school at NYU when my mom was pregnant. When my dad finished law school, he went to take the bar exam, but was not allowed to because he was a non-citizen. But right as that was happening, a case made its way up through the federal judiciary, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to prevent non-citizens from taking the bar exam, and that changed how bars across the country allowed folks to participate in the legal profession, and that really gave my entire family a different foothold on life in America, and including creating lots of opportunities for me. And so I think, since that time, maybe not consciously, I've always thought about ways to make our society more inclusive and more fair. In terms of digital work, over the last couple of years at CAA, even though we are a very local organization with grassroots programs in San Francisco, Chinatown, we've always tried to find ways to provide leadership and be of service to our community more nationally. And one thing that we've seen is that digital spaces and platforms such as WeChat are becoming increasingly important to how our community gets information, how they communicate with their peers, how they're able to stay in touch with loved ones overseas. But that these platforms have a lot of the same problems that our English language social media platforms have, which is there's a lot of fake news, there's a lot of polarization, disinformation campaigns. And they also present some unique challenges. For example, they're regulated very differently, and they're also censored in many cases. And you also have fewer diverse points of view. And so essentially, if you're on WeChat, you're only hearing from other Chinese people. You're not hearing from other people of color. You're not hearing from other ethnic groups. And that can become very, very problematic in terms of what we would like to see with a more pluralistic world. And so, we've launched a digital engagement program that includes both creating and distributing more progressive content in Chinese language. That also includes some organizing experiments on, for example, the Yes on 16 campaign, as well as getting information out on critical issues, including census, including immigrant rights, education equity, issues that may be at play in this election. And so this work, we've been able to begin to explore how a local progressive organization can try and build networks beyond where we have our physical base. So that includes in different parts of California, as well as different states, including the Midwest. And so again, I'm happy to be here and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Vin, and to all the attendees. So we're going to dive into a brief discussion, hitting on some of the specific strategies, some of the platforms that have been successful, but also things that haven't necessarily. I'm just going to share my screen again real quick, just to kick this conversation off. That we have largely oriented around a couple of pillars. The importance of empowering diverse teams. A challenge that we've noticed with a lot of digital first programs is that they're often disconnected from communities that they aim to engage. Often staff or leadership will not be reflective of the communities, particularly when it comes to BIPOC engagement. And by BIPOC, we mean Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. And so ensuring that these tools and strategies and platforms are being integrated into diverse coalition building and organizing. Data is really important, and that decisions are made using data. But unfortunately, how a lot of political data is aggregated and collected can sometimes intrinsically leave out underrepresented and new voters, particularly when it comes to the reliance on vote propensity scores, for example. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. And then finally, adaptability is key, that these are rapidly changing times. The environment in a couple weeks from now will very likely look different today. So ensuring that organizations have the skills, the leadership, the support to navigate a very changing environment. And we'll hear some examples of that, hopefully through this conversation. I want to acknowledge Nick Anway, who's was at Ash Center, is now at the law school, who has been working with us on a lot of this work as well. And so on that, Vin, building upon your what you were saying about WeChat, I was curious if folks could weigh in on some particular realities about your constituencies and some of the platforms that you're finding effective. So for example, Escadar and Pushback integrates Facebook Messenger, for example. And perhaps maybe as a starting point, we can, and building off what Vin was saying about WeChat, hit on a couple of platforms that people are spending more time on, and what you're seeing in terms of traction amongst your target constituencies.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that point, Nick, thank you about Pushback. So I think one of the big advantages that we have is that we are a primary content forward organization. And so we attract our subscribers and audience based on the content that we produce, that we test, and we know is of interest to our people. And so Black people over-index on Facebook and Instagram. So those are the two platforms that we are in most heavily. And as I mentioned, part of our strategy for growth is to expand onto other platforms, including podcast, and really thinking through that concept. It's, when you're on Facebook or on Instagram, you have certain concentrated amounts of time that you're engaging in that content, whether it's for a couple minutes between meetings, like I think we all kind of know we do, or more brief engagement. Whereas with podcast, that is an engagement that you can have with your audience for longer periods of time. So we have been thinking about strategies where we can get our folks engaged for longer periods of time and hearing discussions between experts around Black liberation. And so that is the growth mindset that we currently have in mind. And that is working for us at Push Black.
Escar, just to elaborate just a little bit on that, how do you know when things are working? Like, I'm sure that's a much longer conversation, but just to give a flavor of some of the ways that you test stories, for example, and what that decision-making looks like.
Right, so our content team is pretty well-oiled engine at this point, and you know, they produce many more stories than actually are sent out. So we do take a subset, because we have a very large audience, we can take a subset of our stories and test them and see how much engagement we get before we broadcast them more broadly. And our content team obviously also has our ear on the ground about what is relevant in current news, but also really thinking about not necessarily being reactive only to things that are happening in the moment, but thinking about how current events relate to history, right? So our content is really anchored in Black history and culture. And so through those mechanisms of understanding through surveys and also testing what resonates with our audience, we get an understanding also of what our priority pieces to send out through various platforms. Others
on platforms that you are spending more time on than others? And Vin, you mentioned WeChat. Arianna, what are you spending time on in North Carolina?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I was thinking about how much as with all of us here being digital strategists, you think about like, what is the goal or what are we trying to do here? And so Mijente as a national organization has much broader goals on like narrative shifting that actually rely a lot more on what Escadar was talking to, referencing in terms of content creation. So we're nowhere near the production team that is Push Black, but I do think, number one, see it as a source of inspiration, but grounding it in Latinx history. So there's their kind of like broader set of goals. But what I'm going to speak to specifically is the work that I'm doing in North Carolina. So I just want to create a distinction there for platforms. And so here, the puzzle, the set of issues is voter engagement, right? During a pandemic. And so how do you get a community of folks that has been largely underengaged as a community in terms of civic engagement in a state, and get them wanting to talk about voter registration when they don't know if they're going to pay their light bill? So I just like want to name that super clear about what the context is. And so what we have found has been working here is to use number one, visuals matter, and so does language. And so we do a lot of work that like, we use platforms, but we are very intentional about the kind of content we produce because it needs to be compelling enough for people to want to give it any attention. And we use Facebook for our older folks, Facebook Messenger. WhatsApp is I never thought in my life I would spend as much time as I do on WhatsApp these days. That has proven to be a successful, just like basic tool that sounds like, of course, why would you like, cool, we get it, WhatsApp is great, but it's like, no, it can actually be used for organizing and keeping people in touch in a state where like folks are very spread out. And then Instagram as well. And so using each of those platforms as ways to get people involved in the campaign, to get them to volunteer, and then get them to register to vote. And so it's really attempting to connect with people using multiple touch points to ultimately get them to register to vote, but also to get engaged in the campaign so that then we can pivot towards making sure that they vote now that they've registered, which is what we're doing a lot of our work now, is mobilizing people to vote. And then there's things like phone banks and all of that, but those are the things that I'm thinking about. It doesn't sound as sexy or anything like that, but it's really about like, what are the tools that we're using that are actually yielding results, which mean people actually register to vote in a system that's only available in English in North Carolina as of now, or getting them to commit that they're going to vote and seeing some level of engagement overall in the campaign.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on platforms. I mentioned WeChat. Obviously, that's a very Chinese language and Chinese diaspora specific one. It's also been in the news lately because the Trump administration essentially wants to try and shut it down over, alleged national security concerns. So I think, our community is also starting to migrate over to something called Telegram. And so I think, it's interesting to see that happen. But I would say, our constituency isn't just Chinese speaking, and on the English language side, some of the unique distinctions that we try to make is like, well, what do we do in terms of more organic reach versus like when we have campaigns that can employ paid digital media. And so those paid digital media strategies, we are able to see some analytics about, where our community is at. And here I'm defining that community very, very broadly. And so for the Yes on 16 campaign, thinking through everything from Pandora to Spotify to the other platforms that folks have mentioned for different purposes. But when it comes down to real engagement, it's our text banks that, can reach 20,000 people a night with volunteers, right? And so, I think it's easy to forget that things like, texting are still important digital strategies, especially that can be powered by volunteers, that can be sort of synced up with, things like voter files. And that, continues to be very, very powerful, especially the way both, desktop, using desktop for texting is becoming much more sophisticated as well.
In Wisconsin, our experimentations for our digital organizing cohort kind of focuses on Facebook Messenger, and some early takeaways are that resources like things like COVID and RSVPs are valuable for people who are already subscribed, but they do not have the kind of share rates required to drive organic subscriber growth. And so we are moving away from resources and RSVPs and leaning more into petitions and pledges to take action.
A question that came in from Rachel on the chat. Any thoughts on Twitch?
Well, I'll just say, there's always something new. And I think we try and follow what our young people are doing. And I think Twitch is certainly out there, but we haven't figured out a way to integrate any of our work on there. It's sort of, I think what we've also kind of looked at is, when we bring up Twitch, we always think about TikTok and like, okay, is there really anything that could be done here? And we haven't found that yet. I'd love to hear stories from the community in the field for how that might work.
There's a number of folks on this Zoom, on this call, that are in the product design space or data scientists. And curious, like, as you navigate the different platforms, some of the organizing specific tools, some of the data sources that are out there, are there improvements that you would like to see in terms of how some of these platforms function, particularly when it comes to communities of color? And then for anyone who is involved in whether it's app development or data science, things that you hope we can do a better, that community can do a better job of moving forward, or have there been obstacles that you have seen consistently come up in your work?
No, I can jump in. I think that, there's sort of two different pieces for us, and sometimes they're at cross purposes, right? So I think on the one hand, we want these platforms to be much more responsible in terms of shaping how the discourse happens, and addressing hate campaigns, addressing online bullying, harassment, So there's a whole range of things, and obviously a very public campaign around some of Facebook's bad practices, right? And so I think that they all need to do a better job in that way. I think when you have some of these apps that are international, the regulatory environment and political environment to shape that can get pretty tough. And so I think we are still seeing the evolution of how these platforms understand their responsibilities and to what degree either responsible governments can play a role, knowing that not all governments and the state is responsible, right? So I think that's still taking shape. And then the other hand, there's like the more practical things that can help us, which is the analytics and the insights, and why I say it's at cross purposes, because that oftentimes requires users to give up more of their own information and privacy. So I think that I think with some of our stuff, like being able to really target who's seeing our content can be really helpful. But there's a little bit of a double-edged sword with that, right? And so I think, for civil rights groups in particular, like trying to find that balance is something we're like in the middle of.
Yeah, just to echo Vince's first point about responsibility of platforms, right? It seems like there are platforms that are moving on some of those policies and regulations, but they're kind of blunt tools at this point. And so conversations and interactions about tough topics in Black history or other news topics can sometimes get flagged, right? Because the process is still so new. So on the one hand, of course, we need these protections, but on the other hand, especially now, as we are so close to the election, it can become operationally problematic and have us have to go through extra hoops. And, that's sort of, I think that's part of the challenge with trying to move this quickly during this compressed period leading up to election. So that clarifying those processes, having more transparency around what gets flagged, things of that nature, I think would be super helpful.
And, I think there's a lot of news last week with the announcement from Facebook around ads leading up to the election, which seemed to have a lot of mixed reaction. And I think that blunt instrument approach, as Escadar described, is very real for describing how that regulation often happens. Arianna or Simone, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes. So I think the access to tech is there, but I think there's just sometimes so much tech that it's overwhelming for BIPOC organizations. I think BIPOC organizations need access to technical support and training. And so if there are any, funders on this call, any in-kind giving or giving in general should include, some technical support and training. Additionally, if you are an app developer or data scientist, include members of the BIPOC communities in your UX design, focus groups, things like that, so that people of color are in mind from the beginning.
I want to go to a question that came in from the audience, from Raleigh Cole at the Sagamore Institute for Policy Research. How do you deal with the digital divide in your strategies? And just to elaborate on that a little bit, considerations for communities you work with that might not be as obvious to folks. One thing that comes to mind is some of the doxing and targeting that you often see of BIPOC activists, and sort of this tension between wanting to be out there more, but also how that can often lead to personal attacks on people, particularly online. So, part one, dealing with digital divide in your strategies, and then two, some of the unique challenges facing BIPOC organizers online.
I think there was also a question relatedly in the chat about considering social media usage and age groups. And So I guess that's part of the divide also. And earlier in the conversation, LaShonda, you said you were just joining. I just wanted to recap that part of the way that we address that issue is diversifying the platforms that we're on. So some of you might know Facebook skews a little older than Instagram. And then, so the ability to diversify the platforms that you're on, I think is one way to address that. And as you know, Vin mentioned, less discussed in these spaces, but text messaging is still a way in which to reach people. So I think that's one concrete way you can address the divide in terms of age group.
Yeah, I think that the age issue is really important, you know, when you talk about digital divide. And I think sometimes in a rush to make things cheaper or more technology centered, we do lose lots and lots of folks. So for example, with the census, there was a big push to have it be primarily online. And then especially with the COVID shutdown, you know, seniors in Chinatown, you know, they've just not been able to participate in the same way. And yes, you know, they do have cell phones, right? But, you know, trying to do a form over your cell phone while also being able to get help on your cell phone and speaking to someone, you know, it's not the same level of access. You know, even, you know, conversations like this, like thinking about folks who may be hearing impaired, you know, there are all sorts of ways that, I mean, we've been talking about digital divide for 20 years, 30 years, right? So, you know, and I think that I think we should approach it as not something that's like, oh, it's there and you solve it, but there are always new ways that people are being left out, and that we have to consistently kind of go back and see what we can do to be more inclusive. On the digital security side, I mean, I think we've kind of tried to break it out into two parts that are very interrelated. So there's like the digital part, which is how can people protect their personal information and their personal security, right? And then there's the other component, which is really beginning to develop new norms around, you know, how we treat one another, right? And, you know, I think ultimately, you know, the solutions will have to, you know, have a mix of both, right? But I think there is a severe underinvestment, including from these platforms themselves, to be able to help people do that. And so we do have lots of folks who are personally attacked, and we've learned the hard way about thinking through, you know, different ways of addressing that. You know, and I think, you know, these are very hateful attacks, personal level, but they're also very institutional attacks, whether it's trying to hack into our systems, and things like that. So, you know, I think this is all going to be for all of us to wrestle with in the coming years, because it's only going to get worse in my view.
Thanks, Ben. Arianna or Simone, anything you wanted to add to that? You know, I would just say from my perspective that anyone involved in moving resources to organizations, to not force groups into having to choose between staff and technology. And, you know, a lot of these tools that have emerged over the last few years, some of which, you know, are very promising, but are also very expensive. And to avoid putting organizations in a position where they have to choose between staff and certain platforms. And also, you know, not to force organizations into using whatever platform is most readily available, that it really is a good fit for the organizations. Often we've seen organizations being sort of forced or pushed towards using certain tech when the staff, the volunteers aren't really bought into it, and it usually doesn't work when that's the case. So just being mindful of, you know, in order for digital strategies to work, you really do need, you know, human beings engaged in that decision-making process and comfortable with that tech. You know, we've seen a few questions around voter suppression, and, you know, even in normal times, voting and election changes can be complicated. These are clearly not normal times when it comes to vote by mail, for example. Request rates, particularly for BIPOC voters, is much lower than for other voters. ways that your efforts are addressing this, and any takeaways in terms of promising practices for informing people around election administration and thus hopefully fighting voter suppression.
I think for Wisconsin, where we get it right is we are working and leaning on our trusted local organizations to deliver information. I think no one could have precipitated this amount of misinformation or attacks. And so I think we got it right with that. Facebook advertising is great for this, and that's where we are seeing success. So if you are interested in knowing more how to mitigate voter suppression, I think using targeted educational ads would be a good avenue.
Thank you, Simone. I will double down on the targeted educational ads. So that is something we're looking at. Again, going back to like creating culturally relevant content that is also in languages that people understand is very helpful for people to want to engage with their process. So we are working on that as well, particularly on Facebook. The other, I feel like what I'm going to say is going to sound controversial, but so one thing that we've been finding is that absentee voting sounds just very, very confusing to a lot of voters, Latinx voters in particular. And so we are absolutely going to have already started engaging in the work of doing voter education on that front, but I've also found that if we encourage people to do early voting, they feel much less reluctant to engage in that process. And so we are finding ourselves actually really starting to think about how we're going to set up like poll watching specific for our folks, and then also for early voting site locations, and then very much encouraging people that if what they feel the most comfortable with is going to be early voting, that is okay, but that they need to make sure they do it. And so actually starting like, you know, traditional field programs for any campaign would tell you should not be talking about a voting plan right now. And yet we are living through some of the most challenging times. And actually we are finding that talking about voting plans in this moment and mixing that in with voter education is what is working best to get people to say, I trust you to do this with me. So let's okay, we'll do that. You'll follow up and then we're going to move forward towards voting. And so also just want to echo the importance of having messengers that are trusted in the community. And so for us, that means really developing organizers from the different cities and areas and equipping them to have good conversations with folks so that they feel compelled to want to do early voting and want to engage in a process. Because when we talk about voters being underengaged, if no one has been asking a group of people what they think about something, if they should vote, asking them to go through a very complicated process to do something they haven't done before is not your best selling point. So those are, you have to be able to engage it in a larger conversation.
And I think North Carolina is very reflective of a state navigating some really immediate challenges. So it's going to be, but really interesting to see how Mijente's work navigates this election cycle. There was a question that came in from Devin Murphy, making the most of digital budgets through the course of this election cycle and beyond. I think what a digital program looks like is evolving, and that you're seeing more of an integration between like communications and organizing and field and digital. And so like the definition of digital, I think, is very different perhaps today than it was maybe a year ago. But any insights for folks who are tasked with putting together budgets, or any challenges or successes on that front?
Well, yeah, I think you kind of are getting at this, Nick. It starts to blur, and so I think because things start to blur, like the key is to try and integrate, right, to kind of make the most out of the budgets that are there. So, if there are paid media campaigns, that they're tightly connected to the organizing efforts, and if there are organizing efforts, they're tightly connected to the ability to do very, very grassroots, like earned media, letters to the editor, right? So I think that there's very few pieces that don't have some digital component anymore. And so I think it's more about trying to make sure that these things aren't sort of siloed off. I think that, I saw in the chat something about blended programs, and I think that's right. Like, I think there has to be sort of an overview that makes sure that everything is integrated. And I think that can get complicated because sometimes like the money surges in late and folks want to do digital for like an election. But the reality is those efforts are going to be much stronger in between, elections. We're actually building the community and social infrastructure that then allows organic digital reach to actually be effective, as opposed to needing to then just pony up more and more to hopefully get more eyeballs on your content.
Yeah, I totally second that. I think that's articulated very well. And I was also thinking, while Vin was talking about the funder landscape, and there's, I think, a variety of understanding across funders about what it means to build a digital program, the interconnectedness between that continual conversations that we've all been talking about with our folks, and how that connects to our success down the line, and what it means to support organizations that are doing this work outside of an election year, in addition to what it means to fund organizations that are doing experimentation. So as Nick said, like, this is super data driven. Push Black and other organizations are testing. So what does it mean for funders to come along in that conversation to support experimentation and testing, which I think are conversations that some folks are more open to than others, but really they're the bedrock of our success.
Mm-hmm. We are in our closing couple minutes, unfortunately, but I did want to give the panelists an opportunity to weigh in on trends that you anticipate, either for the remainder of 2020, but also in the not too distant future. Lots of groups that folks are working with are also going to be engaged in redistricting work, as well as other activities, issue advocacy, and elections surely to come soon. And things like blended organizing and digitally savvy relational organizing, online voter registration. We've seen a lot of that, the utilization of SMS messaging. What else are people anticipating in the not too distant future?
I think too often digital relationships are transactional. You post this thing, get a like, okay, and then that's it. But I think moving forward, I think users are expecting and wanting even more transformational relationship with the content that they engage in. I know here in Wisconsin, we have been developing subscriber relationships since the beginning of the year with high quality content and things that build trust. And I think that is where we are hoping to see success.
Well, I don't think, the digital strategies are a panacea for very much. In some ways, I think they also create a whole host of new problems, and kind of the market forces drive towards like new, and often just trying to fix the problems afterwards. And so, I think, unfortunately, those problems often come at the expense of communities of color. And I think, another already disadvantaged or disenfranchised communities. And so I think that's something we need to pay attention to. I agree with Simone that there is this opportunity, though, for how we think about distributed organizing. That there is something between just completely like blasting out things to the public, and then also like texting, right? And I think the real promise is like to be able to help inform or shape real communities of conscience online and in digital spaces, where there's leadership, where there's transformation, where people are on some type of journey together, and they're not necessarily physically in proximity. I think that's like the promise. I think we have a long way to go for that. But I think, you do see how marginalized folks can find one another in online spaces, and I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, and just a small point to add there, I think in the context that we're in of a pandemic, as well as the economic challenges, we know how high unemployment rate is, I think that we all really also have an opportunity to continue to support our people in navigating a challenging couple of years to come. So I think that Pushback is already doing this through various partnerships, but I think that we have it's a challenge and it's a heavy challenge, but there is really an opportunity for us to continue with this momentum around this voting work and to continue to support our people and in these challenges that we're all going to be facing for a time to come, I think.
I feel like everyone hit everything that I would say, so I don't really want to be repetitive if I'm being honest. We have a great panel.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. I'm sorry that we are up at our hour and I feel our host may have to close things down, but there will be follow-up, I believe, from this meeting with contact info as well as some additional materials that folks may want to share. To the guests and attendees, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. And to our panelists, thank you very much. I know you're all very, very busy, and thanks for taking the time to do this. And to the Ash Center people, Melissa, Sarah, James, thanks for all your help in making this possible. Okay, everyone, talk soon.
Thank you, Nick.